Now, the rapture initiates it, as we all know. The Bible clearly teaches a pre-tribulational rapture. There's no doubt about it. There are so many Christians nowadays who have gone astray when it comes to this very cardinal doctrine of the Bible. Most of them have been led astray into believing that we are going to go at least partially through the tribulation. Some believe we are going to go through the entire tribulation. Why is that they believe this? It's because they do not rightly divide the word of truth. They don't understand what the Bible is all about. They don't understand dispensations. They don't understand how God deals with people in various times, in various ways. They don't understand this. That's why they fall into this error that of believing that the church goes through the tribulation, either partially or fully. Now, the rapture initiates this great tribulation, and the rapture happens suddenly. Nobody would be expecting it. It's going to happen suddenly, and therefore the coming of the day of the Lord will also be sudden, without any warning. So the time that we are talking about, the time that Paul says we should be knowing, is the time of the rapture. Is the time of the rapture. And the time that he's talking about in this verse, in Romans 13 verse 11, and that knowing the time, this time is connected to the church's rapture and to the judgment seat of Christ, which is going to take place immediately after the rapture. Right? We all know that. Paul clearly talks about this in Romans and 1 Corinthians, that there's going to be a judgment for born-again believers. It's a believer's judgment. We're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And here, of course, as we know, we are not going to be judged for our sins, but we are going to be judged for our works. And that's something that every born-again Christian should take seriously. And like some preachers say, we should live in the light of the judgment seat of Christ. When Paul spoke about the judgment seat of Christ, he spoke about being afraid. Why should we take it lightly? Why should we make it look like it's nothing really? It is something. You're going to get or lose rewards at that judgment seat of Christ. So this time is to do with the rapture of the church. It's to do with the judgment seat of Christ. In the New Testament, there is another term that is used for the day of the Lord, and it's called, actually there are two ways in which it is described in the New Testament. Firstly, it's called the day of Christ. And it's also called the day of Jesus, or the day of Jesus Christ. The day of Christ includes both the rapture and the judgment seat of Christ. That's his day. The day of Christ. But it's not limited to the rapture and to the judgment seat of Christ. The day of Christ begins with the rapture, includes the judgment seat of Christ, but it also encompasses the whole of the tribulation. That's what the day of Christ is about. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul says, that ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. He says, do not believe people who have told you, he's talking to the Thessalonians, that the day of Christ is at hand. He says there are some things that must happen before the day of Christ begins. And then he goes on to talk about it. In 2 Thessalonians 2:2, the verse that we have just read, the day of Christ is to do with the tribulation. But now look at Philippians chapter 1 and verse 10. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 10. That ye may approve things that are excellent, that ye may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ. He's saying you live without offense till the day of Christ. That means when you stand before the judgment seat of Christ, make sure that you are without offense, because your works will be judged there. Look at Philippians chapter 2 and verse 16. Philippians 2:16, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Paul knew that his works would be judged. So he's saying, I want to rejoice in the day of Christ when I stand before the judgment seat, and I don't want to have run in vain. I don't want all my labor to go in vain. I want to receive rewards. So it's connected to the judgment seat of Christ. Now, when you compare these verses, you understand that the day of Christ is the rapture of the church in connection to 2 Thessalonians. It is the judgment seat of Christ. And thirdly, it is the entire tribulation. That's what the day of Christ means in the Bible. So how do we know if it's time yet for the rapture? God says you should know the time. How do we know the time? Is it time for the rapture? I believe it is. We are closer than ever. And I'm not saying just because time passes, we are getting closer. I don't mean like that. I mean like it's really very close. Right? People have always said that Christians have always been talking about the rapture as being imminent. Right? Preachers have preached saying the rapture could happen now. But in those days, right, everything was not in place for the rapture to take place. But today, everything is in place, as I'm going to show you. Everything is in place. Now, how do we understand if we are really close to this time of the rapture of the church? There are three passages that I want to draw your attention to. Something that you may be very familiar with, but still bear with me because there are some things that you may not have learned before. Look at Matthew chapter 24 and we'll read verses 4 through 6. Matthew 24 verses 4 through 6. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. So the first thing the Lord said is to take heed lest no man deceive you. So deception. Secondly, in verse 5, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. There'll be false Christs. Then in verse 6, and ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So the third sign is wars and rumors of wars. Now, this last phrase, which says, but the end is not yet, that tells you that these things are going to take place in the church age, and it's not talking about the tribulation. How do we know? He says, but the end is not yet. Remember that the end is always a reference to the tribulation, especially the second part of the tribulation, but in this context, it's the entire tribulation. So he says, the end. The end is not yet. The tribulation doesn't begin yet. Before the tribulation begins, you will see deception, you will see false Christs, wars and rumors of wars.